Imagine walking into a monastery, right? And instead of taking a vow of lifelong celibacy, the monk looking across the table tells you that true chastity is defined by, like, how you treat your spouse during an argument over the electric bill.
Right, yeah. Or, imagine signing up for a life of poverty, but instead of wearing some itchy hair shirt and living in a cave, you're challenged to figure out how your 401k and your weekend grocery run are directly impacting marginalized communities.
Exactly, like communities on the completely other side of your city. I mean, we have this very binary idea in our heads about intentional living, don't we?
Oh, absolutely.
You're either fully in the world, just, drowning in the noise of mortgages and social media algorithms and career ladders, or you completely retreat from it. You shave your head, you take a vow of silence, and you hide.
Yeah, we treat the sacred and the mundane like oil and water. They just, they aren't supposed to mix. If you want the deep, disciplined rhythm of a spiritual life, the assumption is just that you have to abandon the complexities of the 21st century to actually get it.
But today, we are looking at a radical rule book that just completely shatters that binary. We are doing a deep dive into a text that attempts to drop ancient, highly disciplined monastic rhythms right into the messy, chaotic reality of a day job, a family, and a modern social life.
It's wild to even think about.
It really is. So our mission today is to dissect the 8th printing of, it's called the Common Rule of the Sacramental Community of the Coworkers of Christ, ratified in 2025. Mm-hmm. And this document is a foundational framework.
Right.
It contains the rule, covenants, and general statutes for a community trying to build an alternative to modern alienation.
Yeah.
But before we get into the heavy psychological friction of how they actually live, we need to decode what this group even is. Because the text describes them as an autocephalous community operating within the independent sacramental movement. And I mean, that is a massive wall of theological jargon right there.
Oh, it really is a mouthful.
Yeah, what does that actually mean?
So let's break it down, because the structure explains the freedom they have to even write a rule like this in the first place. The word autocephalous literally means self-headed. Well, in an administrative sense, it just means they are completely self-governing. They don't answer to a pope or a global synod or some massive bureaucratic denominational headquarters. They steer their own ship entirely.
Got it.
Now, the independent sacramental movement part is where it gets super interesting. Imagine the ritualistic depth of the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox traditions, right? The incense, the Eucharist, the robes, the ancient liturgy.
Heavy aesthetic stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The independent sacramental movement claims that same historic apostolic succession, that same deep sacramental reality, but they operate entirely outside the jurisdiction of Rome or Constantinople.
So they have the ancient rituals, like the literal bread and wine of the sacraments, but they just sort of stripped away the centralized bureaucracy.
Exactly. And because they aren't answering to a centuries-old global hierarchy, their theological DNA is incredibly fluid. It's very adaptive. When you read the introduction to this common rule, you see them pulling threads from wildly different traditions to weave this new fabric.
Right, because they explicitly draw from Celtic Christianity, the Catholic worker movement, Red Letter Christians, and this broader phenomenon called new monasticism.
Which is quite the mix.
It's a huge mix.
Yeah.
So let's unpack those ingredients, because if you just throw those terms into a blender, you get some serious ideological friction. Starting with Celtic Christianity. I mean, my mind immediately goes to foggy Scottish islands and knotwork tattoos.
Right, yeah, the aesthetic is iconic. But it's so much deeper than the aesthetic. Celtic Christianity, historically speaking, developed somewhat in isolation from the rigid imperial structure of the Roman Church.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it was deeply connected to the natural world. It emphasized the immanence of God, meaning God is present in the dirt, the wind, the animals, and the daily labor of ordinary life.
Rather than just being a distant monarch on a cloud.
Exactly. It was also historically more egalitarian, with abbesses often holding significant authority right alongside abbots. So right out of the gate, this document is channeling a tradition that finds the sacred in the dirt and the mundane.
Okay, so that's the Celtic piece. Then they mix in the Catholic worker movement.
Right. Founded in the 1930s by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin during the Great Depression, this was a radical movement that combined profound Catholic piety with what you might honestly call Christian anarchism or aggressive pacifism.
Okay.
Yeah, they opened these houses of hospitality in the slums to live directly with the destitute. And they weren't just handing out soup. They were living in the poverty themselves, writing scathing critiques of industrial capitalism, protesting wars.
Oh, you have ancient Celtic nature mysticism colliding with, like, 1930s anti-capitalist urban grit.
Yeah, quite the combo.
And then the text mentions red letter Christians. I assume that just refers to the Bibles where the words of Jesus are printed in red ink.
Yes, exactly. It's a movement that essentially says, look, if there's a contradiction between the complicated cultural laws of the Old Testament or even the dense theological arguments of the Apostle Paul and the actual literal words of Jesus in the Gospels,
The red letters
win. Every time. It is a hyper-focus on the Sermon on the Mount. It prioritizes the radical commands to love your enemy, turn the other cheek, sell your possessions over abstract theological dogma.
Okay, and all of this is synthesized under the banner of new monasticism.
Which is the modern attempt to take the core vows of the monastic tradition, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and adapt them for people who are married, who have careers, and who live in urban apartments instead of walled-off rural cloisters.
So the premise here is explosive. We are looking at a community trying to operate an ancient, mystical, intensely demanding spiritual life right in the middle of our hyper-individualistic modern society.
Yeah.
I mean, for you listening, think about your own daily routine, your group chats, your bank accounts. This deep dive is going to map out how these coworkers attempt to completely re-engineer all of that.
It's a massive undertaking.
Huge. But the very first hurdle they have to clear in this rule book is who is actually allowed into this experiment. And the text introduces a concept that completely breaks the traditional monastic model. They call it a generous orthodoxy.
It is the foundational tension of their entire community. The document identifies the CWC as being part of the Free Catholic tradition, and they are adamant about this concept of generous orthodoxy.
Okay, but those two words feel like a total oxymoron to me. Historically, the word orthodoxy means right belief. It implies a very rigid boundary.
Very rigid, yeah.
Like, you sign the doctrinal statement, you agree to the hyper-specific theology, or you are a heretic and you get excommunicated. Orthodoxy usually comes with a massive, heavy iron gate. How does a strict discipline rule coexist with the word generous?
By completely redefining where the boundaries are drawn, the CWC flips the traditional model on its head. They state explicitly in their introduction that age, ability, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, or socioeconomic status are absolutely no barriers to their community.
Zero barriers.
Zero. They view different Christian denominations not as competitors and certainly not as enemies, but simply as diverse, equally valid branches of one universal tree.
Which is a massive departure from the history of religious institutions where the primary function often seems to be defining who the other is so the group can feel secure.
Exactly. The analogy that works best here is thinking of this generous orthodoxy like an open source operating system in the tech world.
Oh, like Linux.
Yes, think of Linux. With an open source OS, you have the core kernel of code. That root architecture has to remain intact for the machine to function at all. In the CWC's case, that core kernel is the gospel, the ancient creeds, the fundamental reality of the Eucharist.
That is the non-negotiable base layer.
Right. But the user interface, the applications, the specific ways the system is deployed on different machines that can be infinitely customized to fit the user.
So the diverse denominations, the varied individual lifestyles, I mean, whether someone is married, single, queer, straight, living in a high-rise, or on a farm, that is the customized interface.
Precisely. They are all running on the same gospel kernel, but it looks entirely different depending on the user's specific context.
That makes so much sense.
The text approaches all religious traditions, even those completely outside of Christianity, with a profound ecumenical spirit. But the CWC uses a much older, more visceral metaphor to describe this than an operating system. They reclaim the biblical story of Pentecost.
Okay, the story in the book of Acts where the Holy Spirit descends, there is a rushing wind, and the apostles suddenly start speaking in different languages to the crowds in Jerusalem.
Right. Now, in many modern traditions, particularly Pentecostal ones, speaking in tongues is interpreted literally as ecstatic supernatural speech.
Like a private mystical prayer language.
Exactly, one that just sounds like syllables to anyone listening. But the CWC reclaims this metaphorically in their rule. They define speaking in tongues not as a supernatural vocalization, but as the deliberate, grueling, empathetic act of trying to understand the distinct lived experiences and languages of people who are fundamentally different from themselves.
Well, really, so speaking in tongues in this rule book is just radical empathy.
Yes.
It's sitting down across from someone whose life choices you might not even fully understand and saying, your lived experience is alien to me. Let me do the hard work of learning your internal language so I can comprehend your pain and your joy.
The text literally says, it is with the gift of speaking in tongues that we try to sort out our differences while listening with a merciful heart. It is the hard work of translation across cultural, political, and personal divides.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because this is where my skepticism really kicks in.
Fair enough.
If your doors are this incredibly open, if your tent is this wide, how does a community maintain any actual core identity? We see this in modern social movements all the time. If a group tries to be everything to everyone, it usually collapses under the weight of its own inclusivity.
It dilutes itself.
Yeah, exactly. Doesn't generous orthodoxy, at a certain point, risk becoming just a watered-down social club? I mean, if anyone can come in and no one is forced to conform to a strict theological checklist, what holds the center together?
It is the perpetual danger of any inclusive movement. The center usually falls apart. But what's fascinating here is that the CWC prevents this by shifting the focal point of their rigor.
How so?
The identity of the community isn't maintained by gatekeeping who gets in. The identity is maintained by the absolute exhausting rigor of how they treat each other once they are inside. They trade dogmatic rigor for interpersonal rigor.
So the test isn't what you think about abstract theology. The test is how you behave when someone deeply annoys you.
Yes, but taken to an extreme. Their core doctrine relies entirely on the Beatitudes from the Gospel of Matthew. You know, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers, and Christ's law of love.
Right.
To illustrate how intense this is, they quote St. Isaac of Syria right at the beginning of chapter 1. Isaac was a 7th century mystic and bishop, and his writings on compassion are legendary.
Okay.
The text quotes him asking, "What is a merciful heart?" And the answer Isaac gives is staggering. He says, "It is the heart's burning for the sake of the entire creation, for men, for birds, for animals, for demons, and for every created thing."
Burning for demons. That is a terrifying level of empathy.
It is a radical, almost impossible standard, a heart that burns with compassion even for the things that actively seek to destroy it. The orthodoxy of this community is maintained not through a rigid checklist of theological purity that you sign before you are allowed to take communion.
Right.
It is maintained through the daily, grinding, incredibly difficult work of showing mercy to people who offend you, to people who disagree with you, to the marginalized, and to the earth itself.
So if you aren't willing to engage in that level of radical love, the community doesn't even have to excommunicate you over a doctrinal dispute. You will naturally push yourself out because the environment of constant demanding mercy is just too uncomfortable for someone who wants to hold on to their bitterness or their ego.
Exactly. The friction of the environment does the sorting for them.
Yeah.
But that raises the practical question. If you have a wide tent full of highly diverse, opinionated, modern people, and you are demanding this exhausting level of interpersonal mercy, how do you actually govern their daily lives? How do you prevent absolute chaos?
Which brings us perfectly to the concept of the rule itself. Because, I mean, the word rule carries an immense amount of baggage.
So much baggage.
When someone says, "I live by a strict rule," the modern mind immediately recoils. We think of authoritarianism. We think of a bureaucratic red tape nightmare or some charismatic leader micromanaging what you were allowed to eat or who you were allowed to talk to.
Yeah, the modern aversion to authority is profound, and for good reason, given the history of institutional abuse. But the CWC explicitly re-engineers what a rule actually is. The word itself comes from the Latin regula, which originally just meant a straight piece of wood used to measure things, or a signpost.
Oh.
The document states clearly that this rule is a measuring rod or a compass. It is explicitly not a set of bureaucratic constraints, and it is not someone else's program for your life. It is a framework freely accepted by consenting adults to guide them toward a chosen goal.
So it isn't a cage.
Not at all.
So what does this all mean? I think the analogy that works best here, and you listening can probably picture this, is thinking about the lattice you use for growing tomatoes in a garden.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right, because if you just plant a tomato vine and leave it completely alone to its quote-unquote natural freedom, it's going to sprawl over the dirt. The vines get tangled, the fruit sits on the wet soil, it rots, the bugs get to it, and the plant completely fails to reach its potential.
It needs structure.
Exactly. The lattice, the wooden grid you stake into the ground over it, isn't there to imprison the plant. The lattice provides structural support so the vines can climb upward, receive sunlight, and actually bear healthy fruit instead of rotting on the ground.
That's spot on. But, that structural support makes sense for a plant. For a human being in the 21st century, the text demands two things that we are conditioned to absolutely despise: penance and obedience.
Oh, man. Those words sound like the exact opposite of freedom.
They do. They sound medieval. But chapter 8 of the text redefines them as two sides of the exact same coin of human flourishing. In the modern world, penance is usually associated with toxic self-loathing or physical self-punishment.
Right.
But the CWC defines penance simply as a transformative acknowledgement of human brokenness and a deliberate turn toward healing.
It's radical self-awareness. It's looking in the mirror and having the guts to admit the gap between who you actually are and who you want to be without making excuses.
And taking active responsibility for closing that gap, that is penance. And obedience undergoes a very similar transformation. The text is incredibly careful to state that obedience is not blind submission to a dictator. Obedience here is defined as a collaborative alignment with God's will and the consensus of the community.
Okay, consensus.
It is the willingness to listen to the wisdom of the group, rather than relying solely on your own isolated, often flawed perspective.
The decision-making process they use to figure out the wisdom of the group is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Chapter 13 talks about striving to be in full accord and of one mind. They don't use a simple democratic majority rule system. They aim for complete consensus.
Which is an incredibly ancient and frankly incredibly frustrating model of governance.
I bet. But the text says that if unanimity on a minor issue is elusive, meaning if they just cannot get everyone in the room to agree, they don't force a vote. They don't let a 51% majority crush the 49% minority just to get things done. They gracefully suspend the decision. They just table it.
Which completely flies in the face of modern corporate efficiency culture. In a business, you force the vote, you execute the pivot, and whoever doesn't like it can quit. But the CWC prioritizes the health of the relationships over the efficiency of the bureaucracy. If pushing a minor decision through is going to fracture the community, the decision just isn't worth making yet.
But let me play devil's advocate here regarding this reliance on community consensus and obedience.
Go for it.
In a modern, highly individualistic culture, a culture recovering from various high-control groups and toxic religious environments, submitting your autonomy to a community sounds terrifying, maybe even cult-like.
Yeah, that's a very valid fear.
If you are preaching obedience, what is the actual mechanism in this rulebook that protects individuals from the abuse of power? What stops a charismatic sociopath from climbing the ranks and demanding blind loyalty under the guise of consensus?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the CWC text is actually acutely aware of that exact danger, and they built in specific immunological defenses against high control dynamics. First, they explicitly and repeatedly warn against blind conformity. They state that true obedience requires active dialogue, mutual transparency, and the courage to voice different perspectives.
So you literally cannot be obedient in this community by just shutting up and nodding along with the leader. Silence is a violation of the rule.
Correct. The friction of your dissenting voice is required for the consensus to be valid, but the secondary defense mechanism is even more practical. They protect against abuse by demanding interdependence rather than codependence or isolation.
Oh, that's a crucial distinction.
Right. A cult requires codependence. It requires the leader to convince you that you cannot survive, intellectually or spiritually, outside of the group's bubble. Cults isolate you from outside information. But the CWC explicitly mandates secular engagement.
Wait, really? A monastic rule mandates secular studies?
Yes. Chapter 5 requires members to actively engage in secular studies, hobbies, artistic pursuits, and intellectual development entirely outside of theology.
That is wild.
They want well-rounded, critically thinking individuals who are deeply engaged with the wider world. You cannot brainwash someone who is constantly encouraged to read widely, study secular philosophy, engage in the arts, and think critically. The rule pushes you into the world to study it, which completely shatters the isolation required for a cult to function.
Wow, that is a massive safeguard. Okay, so we understand the compass. We understand the lattice of the rule. Now we need to look at the actual vines growing on it. We transition from the abstract idea of a compass to the highly specific, incredibly countercultural vows that these co-workers actually take. Again, we hit words with massive historical baggage.
Yeah.
Chastity and poverty.
Big words. Historically, taking a vow of chastity meant entering a cloister, remaining single, and practicing lifelong celibacy. It was a rejection of sexual intimacy entirely.
Right.
But Chapter 9 of this rule states that the vow of chastity is available to married and partnered individuals.
How does a married person take a monastic vow of chastity? That feels like a contradiction in terms.
Because they define chastity not merely as sexual abstinence, but as cultivating a pure heart. It is fundamentally about ordering your desires so that love and respect are prioritized above selfish gratification.
Okay, I see.
For a single person in the community, that might indeed mean celibacy, but for a married or partnered person, chastity means building a healthy, deeply respectful relationship that is completely devoid of manipulation, coercion, or objectification.
It's about not using your partner as a tool for your own emotional or physical gratification.
Exactly. It means honoring their dignity as an independent child of God rather than an extension of your own ego. Chastity is defined as self-control, moderation, and fidelity. It is the active refusal to be a slave to your own appetites, whether those appetites are sexual, emotional, or psychological.
It's detachment from the urge to possess another person, which leads perfectly into their vow of poverty. And here's where it gets really interesting. Their definition of poverty is not about living in destitution.
No, not at all.
The goal isn't to be miserable or to wear rags just to prove how spiritual you are. It's about freedom from the tyranny of material possessions. Their guiding ethos for this is a brilliant phrase: live simply so others may simply live.
It is a profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable is how Chapter 16 of the text ties this vow of poverty directly to eco-theology.
Eco-theology.
Yeah, they expand the concept of the monastic vow beyond just the human economy and apply it to the Earth's ecology. They talk about the line from the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." They treat meals not just as biological refueling, but as a celebration of God's providence.
And practically, that mandates the sourcing of local ingredients, minimizing their ecological footprint, and aggressively avoiding waste.
The text calls living on providence an active trust. It isn't passive. For many members, this means literally cultivating their own gardens, getting their hands in the dirt, supporting local farmers. It is a hyper-awareness of the supply chain of your own existence.
But let's look at the friction of this in the modern world. Think about how much money the self-help industry makes right now selling minimalism.
Oh, billions.
You have influencers writing best-selling books on how to declutter your house, how to engage in mindful eating, how to curate a perfectly sparse, aesthetically pleasing, neutral-toned living room. Minimalism has basically become a luxury aesthetic for the wealthy.
It really has. It is often just another form of hyper-curated consumerism. You buy expensive minimalist furniture to prove how detached you are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the CWC flips the script entirely. They don't declutter to make their own lives look peaceful on social media. They embrace simplicity to free up actual tangible resources so they can give them away to the marginalized. The minimalism has an outward charitable trajectory, not an inward aesthetic one.
That's a huge distinction.
But think about you, the listener, who is maybe commuting to work right now. You have a mortgage. You have a car payment. You're trying to save for a kid's college in an economy marked by insane inflation. So I have to ask, how does a modern person with a 9-to-5 job realistically embody a vow of poverty?
Well, the text provides very grounded guidance here. It starts small. It zeroes in on the assertion that unused items in your home should be immediately repurposed or given away. It encourages members to develop physical skills to make their local chapters more self-sufficient, reducing their reliance on massive corporate supply chains.
Okay, so building practical skills.
Yeah, but at its psychological core, the vow of poverty is about detachment. It is a radical redistribution of your psychological priorities. You can own a car to get to work, but the car cannot own your identity.
But the text goes much deeper than just, don't love your stuff too much. There's a quote included in the rule from St. Ambrose of Milan, a 4th century bishop, that completely shatters the modern concept of charity.
It is a staggering piece of theology, St. Ambrose wrote. "The earth belongs to all, not to the rich. Therefore, you are paying a debt, not bestowing a gift."
You are paying a debt, not bestowing a gift. That entirely destroys the modern savior complex of philanthropy.
It does. Philanthropy, as we often practice it, is built on the ego. The assumption is, this wealth is mine, I earned it, and because I am a good, generous person, I will bestow a fraction of it upon you, the unfortunate. It creates a power dynamic where the giver is elevated.
Right.
But poverty for the CWC, viewed through the lens of Ambrose, recognizes that the earth was created as a common treasury for all humanity. Therefore, any excess wealth you accumulate inherently and rightfully belongs to those who are suffering without basic necessities.
So when you give away your excess money or resources, you aren't being a generous, benevolent savior. You are simply returning stolen goods. You're returning what rightfully belongs to the common use of humanity.
It is a terrifying and beautiful way to look at your bank account. It strips the ego entirely out of the act of giving.
That is incredibly challenging. And, it is one thing to try and live out that kind of psychological detachment in the quiet of your own home, tracking your own budget on a spreadsheet. It is an entirely different beast to try and live out that level of selflessness alongside other flawed, annoying human beings.
Oh, absolutely.
You can have the most beautiful theology in the world, but if you can't stand the person sitting next to you at the chapter meeting, the whole system collapses.
Which brings us to the friction of interpersonal relationships. Because community life is where these lofty ideals inevitably crash into the reality of human ego.
The CWC has a very specific structure for navigating this, right? They embrace an ancient Celtic ideal called the Anam Cara,
which translates from Irish to soul friend. Now, historically, some older, more rigid monastic traditions actively banned what they called particular friendships.
Wait, they banned having a best friend?
Yes. The fear in some desert monastic communities was that having a deeply intimate, exclusive friendship would lead to favoritism, gossip, and the forming of cliques within the monastery. The ideal was a sort of detached, equal charity toward everyone without deep emotional entanglement with anyone in particular.
That sounds incredibly lonely.
It was. But the CWC completely rejects that fear of intimacy.
They actively encourage it. The Anam Cara is supposed to be someone who acts as a spiritual mirror, someone who knows your absolute worst flaws, your deepest insecurities, and loves you anyway. But more importantly, it is someone who holds you accountable to the specific rule you've chosen to live by.
Exactly. The only caveat the text provides is that these friendships cannot devolve into the very thing the early monks feared: exclusionary cliques. The love and accountability generated between soul friends is supposed to be a furnace that generates warmth for the broader group. It must overflow into the community, not build a fortress against it.
But naturally, where there are humans interacting deeply, there is conflict. Someone is going to betray a confidence. Someone is going to say something incredibly hurtful. Chapter 10 of the rule insists that conflict is not a sign of failure. It is an entirely natural byproduct of proximity.
Yes.
And this is where their framework for navigating hurt comes in, and they do something vital. They separate the concept of forgiveness from the concept of reconciliation.
In modern culture, we tend to mash those two things together. We assume that if you forgive someone, it means everything goes back to normal instantly, which often traps people in abusive cycles.
Right.
The CWC text frames forgiveness as a decision. It is an act of the will, not necessarily a feeling. Reconciliation, on the other hand, is a grueling process that requires active effort, compassionate listening, and the tangible repair of damage over time.
A profound way to visualize this distinction is to think about fixing a broken bone. If someone carelessly breaks your arm, forgiveness is the act of going to the doctor and having the bone reset.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You make the immediate decision to stop the compounding damage and put things back into alignment. You let go of the right to break their arm in return. That is the decision of forgiveness. But reconciliation, that is the months and months of painful, exhausting physical therapy required to actually be able to use the arm again.
Wow, yes.
It is the work of rebuilding the muscle to the point where you can trust that arm to bear weight. You can forgive someone instantly, reset the bone. But reconciling the relationship takes time. And sometimes, if the other person won't do the physical therapy with you, full reconciliation isn't even possible.
That distinction is incredibly liberating. It demands grace without demanding naivety. And this raises an important question, an essential psychological point, which the text highlights brilliantly. The document states, we can allow ourselves to be forgiven only as much as we can allow ourselves to forgive.
Let's pause on that. That is heavy. We can allow ourselves to be forgiven only as much as we can allow ourselves to forget.
It implies that our internal capacity to experience grace is directly, mechanically tied to our willingness to extend it to others. If we harbor bitterness, if we refuse to forgive the person who wronged us, we literally close off the receptors in our own soul that allow us to feel God's forgiveness for our own massive flaws.
Wow.
The bitterness acts like a plaque in the arteries of the soul. You cannot receive what you refuse to give.
So for you listening, think about your own relationships, your family dynamics, the group chats where someone says something offensive. How do you balance the intensity of walking closely with people, an Ann and Carr relationship, bearing their burdens, without letting their chaos completely destroy your own peace? How do you avoid toxic codependency?
The text emphasizes boundaries. Chapter 14 talks about carrying each other's burdens, but it draws a hard line. You can seek to lighten someone's load, but you must recognize that you cannot prevent their mistakes and you cannot eliminate their pain. The goal of the community and of the soul friend is to be a sturdy shelter, but the individual remains entirely responsible for their own growth. They institutionalize grace, knowing human friction is guaranteed, but they do not enable bad behavior. You walk beside your companion, but you cannot carry them across the finish line.
Institutionalizing grace. That is the perfect summary of the internal workings of this community. But we need to zoom all the way out now. We have looked at the individual vows, we have looked at the interpersonal friendships, but this community does not exist in a vacuum. How do they engage with the broken, loud, hyper-politicized, and often violent world outside their doors?
This is where their theology gets incredibly active. They view themselves first and foremost as citizens of heaven. Chapter 22 details their commitment to what they call the commonwealth of God.
And this is where we have to be very careful, and we want to be totally transparent with you, the listener. Because when any religious text starts talking about the commonwealth of God or interacting with earthly governments, the modern reflex is to assume they are just wrapping a specific political platform in spiritual language.
Right, which happens all the time.
We see theology hijacked by politics every single day. We want to be clear that we are not endorsing any left-wing or right-wing political stance here. We are merely reporting the CWC's theological mandate on this.
Exactly. And looking at the text, what is fascinating is how strictly nonpartisan their mandate actually is. The rule states, the Commonwealth of God knows no earthly king nor any political party. They aren't endorsing a progressive platform or a conservative platform.
Yep.
The text explicitly demands that earthly politics, no matter what side of the aisle you lean toward, must always remain subservient to the gospel's call for peace, justice, and love.
So it doesn't matter if you were at a left-wing protest or a right-wing town hall. If you begin to align yourself more with a political leader or a party platform than with the teachings of Jesus, the text argues you have fundamentally lost the way. The political allegiance must always bow to the spiritual one.
Exactly. And from that fiercely independent, nonpartisan foundation, they commit themselves to peaceful resistance against evil and systemic oppression. They don't just pray about injustice, they actively resist it, drawing heavily on the historical examples of Martin Luther King Jr., Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was assassinated for speaking out against poverty and violence in El Salvador, and Dorothy Day.
And they don't do this resistance by shouting from the safety of a remote woodland abbey. This is where the concept of new-monasticism really hits the pavement. They establish what they call chapter houses and urban religious spaces to offer a ministry of presence. They are setting up shop in the inner cities, in the overlooked neighborhoods.
It is not a flight from the world. It is a deliberate infiltration of love into the world's most broken spaces. They practice radical hospitality. The text dictates that they keep a stranger's room, sometimes a literal physical room in a chapter house, and always a conceptual openness in their schedule, ready for anyone who needs shelter or a listening ear.
You know, a lot of churches talk about being a lighthouse in the community. You know the metaphor. Standing tall in the dark, shining a light so the sinking ships can find safety.
Sure, very common.
But a lighthouse is static. It just stands there safely on the rocks while the ships drown in the storm. The CWC's approach feels much more invasive, much more active than that.
A better metaphor for their urban ministry is capillary action in biology. Think about how water defies gravity to travel from the roots of a massive redwood tree all the way to the edges of the highest leaves.
Okay.
It doesn't use a massive centralized pump. The water moves through microscopic tiny vessels, capillaries bleeding into the micro cracks and structures of the plant, drawing more water along with it through cohesion.
That is a brilliant image.
The CWC chapter houses operate like capillaries. They don't build a massive megachurch and demand the city come to them. They bleed into the micro cracks of the neighborhood, the local gardens, the soup kitchens, the neighborhood associations, bringing the life of the sacraments directly into the margins.
And crucially, when they bring those sacraments into the margins, they don't gatekeep them. The text states they offer the Eucharist, Holy Communion to anyone, without exclusion. They quote the book of Romans, saying, "While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." so they categorically refuse to withhold the sacraments from anyone seeking them.
Think about how radical that is. In so many traditions, the communion table is fenced off. You have to pass a theological test or be an official member or be in a state of moral purity to receive the bread and wine.
Right.
The CWC views the sacraments not as a reward for good behavior, but as medicine for the sick.
For anyone who has ever felt gatekept out of a religious institution, or if you've been denied access to the sacred because of your lifestyle or your doubts, that open table is a profound paradigm shift. It's incredibly refreshing.
It all synthesizes perfectly with a quote from Dorothy Day that the community deeply reveres. She argued that giving shelter or food to a stranger isn't something you do because the stranger reminds you of Christ. You do it because, in a profound theological sense, the stranger is Christ. Plain and simple and stupendous fact, as she put it.
And this radical hospitality extends beyond their local neighborhoods, too. They have a global mission, but their covenant on preaching to the ends of the earth specifically forbids competing with local churches or imposing uniform colonial practices.
Which turns the traditional, often deeply damaging missionary model completely upside down. Historically, missionaries often exported their cultural bureaucracy right alongside the gospel. The CWC exists entirely to collaborate. They go to serve the existing structures, not to conquer or absorb them.
It is breathtaking when you step back and look at the whole picture. Let's trace the arc of the journey we've taken today. We've explored how a modern self-governing community uses the ancient, fluid DNA of Celtic mysticism and the grit of the Catholic worker movement to practice a generous orthodoxy. We saw how they redefined speaking in tongues as the grueling labor of radical empathy. We unpacked how they use a rule as a structural lattice, not a cage, redefining obedience as collaborative alignment to protect against the toxic isolation of a cult.
Exactly.
We looked at their eco-conscious vows of simplicity, viewing excess wealth as a debt owed to the earth. We explored their cultivation of the anamkara, the psychological necessity of separating forgiveness from reconciliation, and finally, their absolute commitment to prioritizing the commonwealth of God over any earthly political empire.
And the most important takeaway here is that you do not have to officially join a monastic order or move into a chapter house to apply these nuggets of wisdom to your own life.
That's the beauty of it.
You can actively seek out an anamkara in your own social circle to hold you accountable. You can practice mindful consumption, not as an aesthetic choice, but as an active redistribution of your resources. You can choose to view forgiveness as a necessary, immediate decision to reset the bone, freeing yourself from bitterness while still maintaining the boundaries required for reconciliation. These are not abstract theological concepts. They are highly practical, daily tools designed to combat the profound alienation of modern life.
Which leaves us with a final provocative challenge to mull over as you go back to the noise of your day. We spent this hour talking about the CWC's common rule, but if you were to sit down at your kitchen table tonight and draft a common rule for your own life, not a to-do list, not a list of New Year's resolutions, but a foundational philosophical compass defining your exact relationship to your money, your friendships, and the strangers you pass on the street, will be the very first sentence.
That is a great question.
Think about the friction that sentence would create in your life tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.
It is always a privilege to unpack these frameworks. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Until next time, remember, the lattice is just there to help you grow. Take care, everyone.